Hi. My name is Soko. I'm a filmmaker based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work in documentary, and I'm honored to moderate this conversation on storytelling and how to simplify stories in the climate change space. Today, we have a couple of amazing people around me. Some are joining us on Zoom as well. I'll introduce them briefly. Right next to me is Laissa Malih. Laissa is a Laikipian Maasai, the first female filmmaker in her community with interests of documenting, linking, amplifying, and scaling up youth, women voices across diverse indigenous cultures in Kenya and the world. She has 5-year experience as a filmmaker and has assumed the position of coordinator in a community-based organization called Maasai Cultural Heritage. She has attended various international conferences on community-based adaptation, and her latest documentary, The River of Brown Waters, which became an official selection of Film Africa, was screened in various festivals in Kenya and the UK. Laissa's goal is to continue to shed light on her people's livelihoods, as well as help upscale their voices so as to help protect and preserve their rights and culture. We would want to see the trailer of River of Brown Waters.
Ni moja kikira mwagino na adu poke. Na ora nkada na tudunye. Niko turkwasi no kusam nigin tukore kito kama hiyo nako da ne jadi kunu
kesba tangaro leng kuna la mana wale pero bi ngene mo mana bodo bi na udayu ando ta mana ni sikar seri tanda lo jare na ba ga es na ba be tiki guna karage Raya me abali me reba amangare ngire waso na ngare ngire.
Wakati alikuwa maji mingi sana akatikangi niendelee kama miezi 4 miezi 5 sasa kuna kitu kama hizo
dogo na amara sela me yomet melo tu do shaga na rega kitia na ra bagda da me banyoshi ide do she egete.
Wakati maji inaisha, shamba inapotea na tunaanza kuhangaika.
Tuanza hapa sasa, naelekea kama miezi 3 sasa. Tunachimba na mkono, hakuna tinga hapo. Tunachimba na mkono, tulipata maji hapo. Hata wale uchungaji zangine nakuta tu kwa miti amekufa sababu kiu ambati maji.
Hamade na mode ndo boge. Hamada da ange da na mode ndo ngani. Ndo bogo shinadi adwa na nje da sini nyanare.
Garengiro narugo. Agar garengu to gai. Ngado ngutu gyare. Ye brari ala chalai.
Karibu sana, Sammy. Director and co-founder of Saracen OMD, one of East Africa's largest independent media specialist agencies providing world-class media planning, buying service to leading local and international clients across the sub-region, and the biggest media agency in East Africa today. OMD, the global media advertising company of Omnicom in 2013, is arguably the world's largest marketing communication network with offices over 80 countries. Karibu sana, Sammy.
Thank you, Sam.
Could we see a short video of some of Sammy's work?
empathy is about cracking the code in terms of true consumer understanding.
We also need to start getting into the habit of just like accepting that people of different ethnic backgrounds and other identities speak, look, and express themselves differently.
Miss Wandati, she's currently the Science and Technology Editor at Nation Media Group, NTV Kenya. Miss Wandati runs an innovative weekly TV feature, Food Friday, which focuses on all aspects of food security, from farm to plate. The Food Friday series has directed public attention towards food security issues in Kenya and throughout the African continent. Her reporting spans a wide range of topics, from good agricultural practices to climate change, reflecting a strong capacity to interact with various actors, including farmers, teachers, and scientists. She's a joint winner of the Food and Agriculture Organization's A.H. Boema Award, and in 2017, she won a Continental Award from the Africa Conservation Tillage Network for her reporting on conservation agriculture in Africa. Here's a short taste of Zeynab's work.
I could walk like this for hours, and it might even take me a day before I hit water. As far as my eyes can see, all I see is wilderness. But guess what? This is actually Lake Magadi that I am walking on right now. This is a major highway. This was the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute.
Inakaa tu kwa mawe asubuhi. Sasa inashindwa asubuhi, watoto wako hapo.
Kuna harufu nyingine inatoka mbaya sana na inatoa affect.
Lakini hapa watu wanakuja kutumia kisiasa.
Thank you. Lastly, but not least, is Pete Murimi. Pete is a Kenya multiple award-winning documentary filmmaker. He's won the CNN African Journalist of the Year award. He's worked as a freelancer for various NGO spaces for documentaries and for the United Nations before working for them as well. He's a producer, DOP, and has gone on to win global recognition for his work. Since 2012, Pete has produced various documentaries for international broadcasters in the continent, and his latest feature, I Am Samuel, has had incredible global reception. One of Pete's pieces, which you're about to watch, Suicide Stories, it spoke to incredible conversations about mental health. Here's a short trailer.
But the number of suicides reported to have occurred is alarming. Whether it is a mere coincidence or a superstitious occurrence remains a puzzle.
When it comes to Kenya, these stories rarely get to see the light of day because a story about murder would get priority in the news, even on the dailies, but suicide rarely gets a headline.
Thank you. So let's give it a go and start. I'm going to start with Zeynab. So you've had incredible experience and you've kind of traversed this country speaking to these conversations on climate change. And I think on the day-to-day, you have to communicate these stories to the public. How has that experience been, and what could you speak to the work that you've been doing and how people have been reacting to these conversations?
Thank you, Sam. I'm very happy to join this conversation today. Apologies for not being able to be there physically. I'm a bit under the weather today. As a journalist, in the number of years that I've been covering climate change and traversing this country, you get to know that your perceptions may not necessarily be what you find on the ground. Because when you sit in the city and you interact with the experts in the city, there's what you think you know about climate change. And then there's what you will find on the ground once you talk to people. You realize that their stories are actually much more real. They are realer than you think. They are realer than what you've been reading because they live in that reality. They see their world changing every day. Like, for example, that trailer we've seen about the Maasai in Laikipia. They were talking about how their water sources are changing. Those are real stories. And you get to see the difference between sitting down and reading it in a newspaper or in a book and actually going out there and experiencing what they're experiencing and seeing what they are seeing and allowing them to tell their stories. The impact comes in when you see how people react to your story. For example, the trailer you ran of my story, The Rising Legs, we did that documentary early this year. I think it was in January, early this year. And when we were reading about how the lakes were changing, how the lakes were rising in the Rift Valley, when we were collecting our research, we were in Nairobi. And then we set out to go across the entire Rift Valley. We started up north in Turkana County, all the way down to Lake Magadi, along near the border with Tanzania. And the stories those people told us of how you go to sleep, an hour or so later you wake up and your house is underwater, your feet are underwater, you go to the market during the day, when you come back a couple of hours later, you can't even identify where your house is because it has been swept away by the water. And those are the stories you hear from the people from Lake Turkana. And then you go to Lake Magadi, the complete opposite is happening, where the water is vanishing and they have no idea why, yet it also sits along the same Rift Valley. So when we did that story, it generated a lot of interest even from the Ministry of Environment. And I did get invited to a few meetings to talk about how the impact of the rising lakes from my perspective as a journalist, what I found on the ground, and then the government would share what they found on the ground and what solutions are being generated as a result. And I know right now there's a panel that's been put together to see how to stop something like that happening again, because right now they don't know if it will happen again or if that's the end of the rising lakes. But what we know for sure is that the maps of those regions around those lakes have to change. That's one thing we know for sure. Kenya's definition of riparian land also has to change. Because for some of these people, especially around Lake Naivasha, Lake Nakuru there, they will tell you, we know what riparian land is. We are very far away from the riparian land, but the water has found us here. So now this new place where they live, they have to give up that land now. And that land becomes riparian land. So what happens to them afterwards? They've been displaced through no fault of their own. They did not move into this riparian land. The water found them there. So now the government has to remap that area, reclassify it as riparian land, and then find alternative land. Where is that alternative land going to come from? See, no. So it becomes a whole complex situation, because even the places where you're going to move them, there are people who live there. They may or may not accept you coming to live with them. They may or may not accept having to share their land with you. So those are still some of the things that the government is having to deal with right now.
And it's incredible that at least we do have journalists who are working in this space, and there's not that many people who are kind of telling the stories from this place, which is like a really good segue for me to move to ask. My next question is for Pete. So people like Zeynab are, yes, they're journalists. On the day-to-day, they have to move around in all these places. And a lot of the work that moves, that we engage with, comes from the governmental organizations, who are the ones who share the dreaded TOR, that the storytellers have to kind of work their way to make sense. How do we want to tell these stories? How has your experience been being engaged to work and tell stories such as the space of climate change? And what has your experience been? And like, where do you feel there's a disconnect between the stories that need to be told, as Zeynab said, there's things on the ground, to how these stories are communicated to the public?
Okay, thank you for the question, and I'm so happy to be part of this panel. I think what should happen, and I remember this early on in my experience, sometimes as a filmmaker, you have the perfect way to communicate a story, and normally it's more like, depending on who the filmmaker is, but like in my approach, like I wanted to make the story like more personal, more intimate, and to have this journey. But sometimes some organizations, a communication manager will come and talk to me, and they have the philosophy of the organization that they want to be part of the narrative. And then now it becomes like a big clash, because I, as a storyteller, I want to tell a story that I think the public will connect with, but sometimes the organization wants to include some intellectual or the company's goal or something, or TORs, like this is what we want to do. So that was a big problem early on. And then I realized after a while, when we sit down and tell them, like, look, this is what will actually work. And what you want, as intellectual as it is, it can only be good for be put in a shelf. So we found, after a while, we found this finding the middle ground and knowing that stories are universal. And sometimes the simpler and the more basic the story is, the more impact it will have. Like, you don't need to cram all the agendas or hit all the points that all the work that the organization is doing. And I think that is a lesson maybe for everyone, I guess, for the organizations to know, like, the simpler it is, the better it is, but also for the filmmakers to think, how can I tell this story that still gives the organizations and the NGOs what they want and for them to meet their goals? Because sometimes I think we as filmmakers have not also explained to the organization how the way we work will serve them well. So I think there's this deficit from both sides not talking properly.
No, that's very true. And some of us have gone through a lot of that conversation, which sometimes you have to make a choice of whether do you want to get paid or do you keep pushing, right? And that's not an experience Laissa had when she decided to tell a story about her community and their challenges and what they are going through. So how was it like making River of Brown Waters? How was that experience different to what Pete is talking about?
Okay, first of all, when I was going to shoot River of Brown Waters, I had to take 1 week to go first in their communities to understand their perspective and to also make them understand the kind of documentary I was making. And going to the communities, I realized that I actually did not know. So I had to humble myself down as a creative, of course, and start learning from their perspective. Because they will tell me stories that I thought I knew, but now they know better. So from there, I started collaborating with them, and they gave me directions. Of course, I had to also take control of the documentary so that it does not deviate from the original plan I had, but also to incorporate the community's voices. And the way I shot it in a simple way, on their day-to-day livelihoods, on what was there that they do not see currently, how the river was before, and now it's how the flow is less or not flowing at all. So those are the kind of things I started asking. And now they gave me stories from the past and current stories. So as if you go watch River of Brown Waters, it's more simplified and more community-based, but a wider audience can get to understand it. And even the NGOs, because I'm in the NGO world, they can also understand and take note from that. Yeah, so that's how I shot mine, the River of Brown Waters. Yeah.
And I can vouch for that now.
Thank you.
And I think the question here is, conversations on climate are very complex in many cases, and they bring up a lot of, I'd say, jargon and terminologies that people kind of shut down when they're trying to engage. And this is kind of your space, Sammy, simplifying the simple ideas. So where do you feel the disconnect is, and how can we start bridging that gap of simplifying this conversation such that both the storytellers and the people who are trying to communicate this information can find a place to engage and share powerful, entertaining stories?
Thank you, Sam. You're right. The discussion on climate change is complex because this discussion starts from a scientific perspective. So when you start from a scientific perspective, it is actually very technical because you hear words like emissions, carbon, methane. You hear about the ecosystem restoration, and these are very complex matters which are not very familiar to the layman, and these are not terms which you use in everyday language. But to fully communicate and disseminate this topic on climate change, what storytellers need to do is to have empathy. And they need to have empathy by communicating the real life stories, like what Zeynab said. Now, there are some real life situations which are unprecedented, but unfortunately, they're on the way. For example, in the past, we've had refugees, and the refugee crisis in the world has been caused by different things. We have war refugees, we have economic refugees. But the next set of refugees, which will be at an unprecedented scale, we will have climate refugees. So in terms of storytelling, we need to talk about what crisis is on the way. We have a refugee crisis on the way. Zeynab talked about the possible displacement of people. Mm-hmm. So that is one conversation which you need to start having, talking about real life issues beyond the scientific. I think we need to leave the science part of it to the scientists and be able to tell stories in our own way. A few days ago, there is a person who I interacted with online. His name is Ron Harper, and he's an asset manager in one of the big American firms. And talking about real life issues and disseminating it, did you know that the property which you own could be worthless in the next 40 years? And I'll explain how. In the past 45 years, what has happened is, because of global warming and accelerated carbon emissions, the world temperature has increased by 1.5%. Now, it is anticipated that the temperatures will increase by 4% by the year 2050. If that happens, the entire south of Florida, for about 200 kilometers, will be submerged in water, which means the United States of America will lose Miami, they'll lose South Beach, and they will lose West Palm Beach, which means whoever has a mortgage of 20 years, you may never be able to complete paying for your mortgage because you will not have an asset anymore. Now, this is far from Kenya, but in Kenya, it is already happening in Kisumu. So it is putting human stories which have actual impact and presenting these stories as what is actually going to happen to affect you sitting here if nothing is done about it. Thanks.
No, it's very true. That there's so much that's going on, and I think something that keeps resonating, and a lot of people have said here, is we as storytellers come from a point of we want to communicate that human element. We want to engage, and I think from Zeynab, Pete, and Laissa said, we go down to the community and we're like, we know this is how we could tell this story, and this is the way the community would understand this story. The challenge now becomes, which I think started with Zeynab saying, is whatever is happening on the ground and what comes from this other side, the more the technical people, there's kind of a disconnect in how we engage and we speak to this. And just going back to Zeynab, and all of you can chip in if you want, is where do we start in engaging with the people who actually, in this case, which is probably the biggest problem, who have the money to do the work? Because otherwise, we have to do it as passion projects, right? And passion sometimes doesn't pay bills. So how can we connect these two spaces? Zeynab, what do you think?
I've come to learn one thing. The NGOs or the donors or the people who have the money, they've got an agenda that they want to push. And their agenda may not necessarily be what the community they're targeting needs. So they will sit in their boardrooms and plan a project. Take, for example, Turkana County. Everybody's always taking farming technologies to Turkana. But the problem with that is that Turkana is a pastoralist community. Farming is not in their culture. You're bringing a solution that is foreign to them without having asked the people in Turkana what solution would work better for them. So first, to bridge that gap, the people with the money need to go to the ground and sit down with the community that they're targeting and talk to them and ask them, in your culture, you have seen this and this and this happening in your community. What solution would you like us to bring to you? The reason I've singled out Turkana is because there was a lot of talk when Kenyans for Kenya happened, and a lot of money was raised for Turkana and irrigation systems were put in place. What happened when Red Cross left? Most of those projects collapsed. And they could not explain why they collapsed. Because you brought a solution to people without having talked to them about if that's what they would want. Because had it been actually what they would have wanted, they would have known how to continue with that project. But most of those projects collapsed. And that issue came up the next year when there was another drought and people started to ask questions, but we brought you an irrigation system. Why are you not able to bring food to generate food out of those irrigation systems? So bridging the gap will start by an actual conversation. Not don't come with your ideas in your head, telling yourself, this is the project I want to implement, without having talked to the person you want to give that project to. Because you will find that these communities are actually not stupid. They are not. They know that their climate is changing. They just know it in a different language, not in the language you're speaking, but in a different language. So we need to learn to speak their language, so that you can now start communicating and actually start having a dialogue.
Does anybody else want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I would love to add on what Zeynab has said. Actually, when you go back to the communities, they really know a lot. It's like I come from an indigenous community, and there are things we call indigenous skills and technologies. You find that actually they really know how to read the weather. It's only now that in the modern day world, we have the modern equipments and technologies. And they know how to tell, like, this season is changing, the weather is going to change. And even right now, they can tell this climate change. It's only that now, climate change was not in their language before. So now they have to come up with simpler terms to explain what is really happening. So they are completely aware of what is happening. They know what the problem is. Now the problem comes with the NGOs and the other stakeholders. You come thinking that because you have this modern education, you have all these equipments, technologies to solve this problem, so you know the solution to the problems. but you don't communicate to the communities and ask what has been the problem. Like, for example, I'm just giving an example. In there's this Northern Highway, I don't know what it's called. You'll find that when the Chinese were building these roads, they kept drilling boreholes because they saw that it's dry, the areas are dry and there's drought. But these boreholes, some of them actually causing conflicts because when there's drought, when there's no water, communities converge. And if you come there first, that's your territory. You see now. So now that causes conflicts. This one, they are fighting because the borehole is not yours. It was built by the Chinese, so all of us can use. But this one says, but I came first. So we are securing water for our livestock and for our families. So I think we should create a platform where before going to the communities, we have a platform where we solve problems, we talk to them and ask them what is the issue. Because there's an observation, what I've made since 2018, that's when I started doing film and working with NGOs. I've been asking myself, but even before, since I was born, there were these big NGOs in the northern side of Kenya. But still, people are facing the same problems. There are no solutions. It's like no one is existing, no government is existing, no NGO is existing. So where is all this money going to, all these resources, where are they going to? What problems are they solving? How are they helping the communities? And actually, that's the problem, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is also the question of who owns the narrative, or who will drive this narrative. For us to drive this narrative and to get this story to be widespread and to be properly disseminated, this cannot happen without the involvement of the people who run rural communities. And the people who run rural communities are the women. We need to put women at the forefront of this story because they are the managers of households and they are the managers of the ecosystem. Now, there are also cultural issues which are to be considered when we put women at the forefront. For example, in some communities, the voice of the woman is considered at the same level as that of a child. So this is a narrative which we need to put to the forefront because they are the ones who are running the rural communities and they need to be at the forefront of telling this story because climate change is going to affect women more than it will affect men. So that is something which must be considered in everybody who is trying to put together a narrative and disseminate the story on climate change and its adverse effects. Thank you.
And that's very true. And also just connecting with what Laissa said and what Zeynab was saying as well is like there are all these spaces and all these conversations that need to be had and all these stories need to be told. And a question I have for you, Pete, is how do we encourage more filmmakers and storytellers to tell these stories and engage with these stories in very powerful ways and in ways that would actually not only generate traction, but actually have movement and, just change things?
Thank you for that question. And before that, I have something to say on the previous question, and then I'll go into this one.
Yes, go ahead.
I remember saying, because I think as storytellers, most of the times we want exactly the same things that the civil society and the NGOs want. Besides, yes, sometimes we want to entertain and sometimes just to inform. But a lot of times, there is an issue or something that's happening, we think the world should know and something should happen, things should come. Like in my situation about mental health in Nyandarua, and which was, I thought this is horrible that it's happening, and let me try and do something that will bring change. So there's a lot of organizations that were trying to do exactly the same thing. And it happened once the film was done, it was the perfect tool to help achieve and amplify the message, to have goals that can be measurable and achievable. So I think filmmakers and the NGOs most of the times want exactly the same thing. It's just to find out how can we work together to achieve that. And now on the question of stories that will have impact. I think what is first of all important as a storyteller is to be true to like the passion of what you want. For example, I know if there's a project or an issue that I'm really passionate about, I'll be committed, I'll be sincere with it, I'll put in the extra shift, and generally the film will be much better, because the voice of the storyteller, you could see the passion and the push there. So it is very hard for, I think, us storytellers to be mercenaries and to get exactly the same product all the time. Like today, you're doing a film about climate change, and then tomorrow you're doing a film about, you could say, mental health, and then the next day you're doing a film about patriarchy. It could be possible, but especially in a very short span of time, because these projects they consume us when you do them, and the time you're doing it for 1 or 2 years, your life becomes the story that you're telling, in a sense. So I think it begins by us filmmakers finding the right partnership and alignments. If climate change is the issue that I really care about and passionate about, have the right access, yes, I should do it. And that partnership will be amazing and the film will be good and change will come for sure. I know that because we've seen that films can change. They can change the world, they can change people, they can change a village, they can change a person. So we can argue about how big the change is, but if a film is done right, there'll be some form of change, 100%. But I think it's just finding that, is this the right film for me to make? That is one of the biggest questions that as storytellers, we should ask ourselves.
What do you think, Zeynab? Or are you extremely motivated to keep telling stories in this space? What needs to happen to keep pushing you or keep encouraging you to work in the space?
The media landscape actually has changed a lot over the last, I think, 5 or 7 years. Right now, we find more and more climate stories getting into either on TV, on radio, or in the newspapers. But the thing is, it's not as often as we'd like to see, and most of those stories are negative stories. That's the weird thing about the media. We like stories that bleed. If it's not bleeding, then chances of it making it to a page becomes difficult. So you'll find climate stories making headlines when it's about a community being swept away somewhere by flooding or another community starving to death somewhere else. But rarely will you find us telling stories about someone who's come up with a solution. So and this also kind of speaks to us as a community, not just the media, because we are a reflection of the society. We tell you what you want to hear. So if you're telling you those stories that bleed, it's because that's really what you want to hear. In order to continue having conversations like this, actually, it's a very good motivation to have us continue telling these stories and also inspiring more people to tell climate stories and tell community stories and stories that have impact on people. But what we lack mostly is capacity. Capacity in terms of access to information, capacity in terms of access to those communities, capacity in terms of access to expertise. Information, by information I mean, you'll find scientists coming up with these brilliant pieces of work, brilliant research that have really, really good stories, but it never gets to the media because either this scientist doesn't know how to access the media to tell them about their research, or this scientist is media shy or just doesn't like media at all. So what we in the newsrooms would like from you in the NGO world is to help us in terms of capacity. When you're going to the field and you think you have a brilliant story you're going to tell out there in the field, it's okay to reach out to the media and pitch that story to us and have them come along with you. If you have a brilliant piece of research, it's okay for you to reach out to us and give us that information, and then we can discuss how to create a story out of it for maximum impact.
That's very true. And I think we were speaking earlier with Laissa, and we were saying why are we discouraged to engage in the space? Maybe you could share part of that conversation.
Okay. First of all, why as filmmakers, as creatives, we are discouraged is because most of the times people don't understand the technical part of shooting. So you find even when someone is trying to allocate, like let's say just for an NGO for a fact, the NGOs that I've worked with several times, you find that when you come up with a story, you've simplified it, this is how you want to tell the story. The funds that are allocated for shooting that story are kind of minimized because they don't understand why do you want such an amount of money to shoot just a simple story. Because like for River of Brown Waters, it took days and months to shoot. But I came out with a 7-minute piece. So someone will be like, but it's just a 7-minute piece and this money is so much. So you find like you end up going to the field to shoot something with very less, so you end up coming out with nothing at all. Because sometimes when you go to the field and shoot these stories, you end up finding other issues that you didn't anticipate. And so you have also to cater for those issues. Let's say maybe I wanted to tell a story maybe of, let's say, the river El Songiro. But when I go there, there's another story the community is telling me. And maybe I have to follow it through for a maximum story in the end. But at the end, I will not follow up with that story because I do not have those funds. And again, the fact that when people are in these big meetings, they think like they know better, but deep down, they have not gone back to the grassroots. So you find that the information they want you to bring from the documentary is different from what you're getting. And sometimes there is where we clash. So sometimes as filmmakers, we get tired, we end up giving them the story they want, but not the actual thing that you know that will push their agenda. Yeah.
And just connecting with what Zeynab spoke about is kind of the access to that information, everybody kind of knowing this is what needs to be done and putting it all together. But then eventually you did come up with the film. We do come up with these stories. They do, we do share them and we do put them out. And I think that's something I want to ask you, Sammy. What can we do to encourage the sharing of this story? Like, what could you speak to the getting this content out to the public, and not also like the public access to this content? How is it? What do you feel like? Where is it right now? And how do you feel that it can get better?
We need to make a decision on the size of the story that we want to tell. Right, in the past 1 year, the biggest story across the world has been COVID, followed by Black Lives Matter. Over the years, the entire world came to believe in the American dream, including those who have never set foot in the United States of America. And America was seen as the land of opportunity, although the situation on the ground is very different, because of the stories that had been told about the United States of America through movies. So a story and impact is as big as the size that we give it. So the climate change story is already becoming the biggest story on the planet. The first agenda in terms of priority for the current president of the United States is climate change. In May this year, which is 3 months ago, the UN launched a 10-year program called the Ecosystem Restoration. Now, these are big stories. So we need to create a story as big as the crisis that is on the way. Now, once we have created these stories and we have a narrative, and we've distilled it down, we've given it a human face. What we need to do is decide how are we going to disseminate the story. We have moved from the era that we were born and raised in, which is the era of broadcasting. We are now in the digital world, whereby we are in the addressable age and in the era of narrowcasting. We've got multiple platforms, and each of these platforms gives us an opportunity to tell a story differently. So we need to engage with all these platforms and reach out to a big population on the planet which is consuming media or information on these platforms, which is largely the youth, and create a movement through consistent dissemination on these platforms. If we do not go that route, this story will die. And what we've observed, even as Zeynab said before, when a story dies, the cause which was the root basis of the story also dies. When a story dies, the cause dies. So I think storytelling in this climate change agenda is actually the most important of all. Thank you.
No, and yes, you're right. Like, we need to find ways, I think, to encourage more people, or perhaps look for routes to have, a lot more TikTok videos about climate change. But the thing that's kind of been going around is like, we don't necessarily have to package it as climate change. And I think how do we get to do that more often? How does my Instagram feed have more conversations about how we can make things better, or push things better? And I think now my mind goes to Greta Thunberg and how her story and what she did kind of blew up in the world and encouraged a lot of young people to start speaking and thinking about climate change. What do you think, Zeynab?
Actually, the young people conversation is something that everyone is struggling with, not just in the climate space, but pretty much every aspect of the economy, because the younger and younger people have a very short attention span. So the things that catch their interest keep changing from minute to minute. So catching their attention and getting them to care about something is a struggle for every sector of the economy. Even in agriculture, the Ministry of Agriculture has tried different campaigns, even having young artists to get them to join agriculture. But then the young people who are getting into agriculture, they look at it as a get-rich-quick kind of scheme. So it's a challenge across the board. But how to get around it? How to get around it is, you see, because the young people know how to use social media. Myself, I'm still struggling with how to use some of the tools on social media and how to use them to tell stories. When it's a story that touches someone directly, then you start to see the young people start to pay a little bit more attention. Not all attention, but some attention. When it's a story that has an actual face, a story that about someone and impact on that someone. The young people don't care about those big terms and Kyoto Protocol and whatnot. It will pass them like the wind. But when you tell them, this is person X living in village Y, this person has no food, or this person's harvest died because of the locust invasion or because of the drought, then they start to show some little bit of interest, and then you start to see them coming up with all these kinds of apps that farmers can use, or apps that can help you predict some the weather changing patterns. I've talked to some students at Kitale Poly and Moi University in Eldoret, and they're coming up with such brilliant technologies. So I think the thing that discourages the youth mostly from participating is lack of support, especially from the government. When they come up with these technologies that will offer you a solution that will help you climate-proof yourself, they don't get the support that they need in order to come up with more technologies or something like that. So you'll hear about a technology or a mobile app, and then within a few or so weeks, it fizzles out and you don't hear about it again. And if you're to find these young people who came up with that technology, they tell you, I was told to do I need what license, and I need what license, I need what license. So the technology it just fizzles out. Another example is a lot of young people are coming up with solutions for power generation in their homes, and they fizzle out because the law has no framework that allows them to actually come up with green technologies or to support them to continue coming up with these green technologies. The way, I don't know if it's deliberate or the government just likes to sabotage itself. The young people lack that support. Even when it comes to patents, a young person will go and pitch a technology to a potential investor or a potential somebody with the capacity to actually scale it up. The young person will be told, your project still needs a lot of work. Your project is not good. And you go away, only for you to see it implemented without your name, with someone else's name. So we need to create that environment that encourages the young people, that tells them your technology is safe, your intellectual property is safe. We will support you through this journey, because you realize the way they want to join the conversation is on a solution kind of way, or the solution end of the conversation. That's where young people's interest mostly is in, and technological solutions. They're not really interested in the how we got here, the what caused this. They want to look at it, what do we do about it now? And now what we need is that framework that encourages them to bring those solutions, and that tells them you will be supported, your technology will be safe, and it will continue.
I really like that. What do you think, Sammy?
Yeah, I agree. And we have all these multiple platforms which the youth disseminate their stories. But the thing is, how can we make this topic interesting? How can we rope them in? How can we have this as a conversation which is ongoing and something which has traction, something which will never stop? Reflecting back and remembering the conversation around HIV. HIV was a very complex subject, but the way it was embraced by this government and all governments in the world, it became a global movement. And it became a global movement because of the people who are going to be most affected by the HIV scourge, which was the youth, which was going to have a direct impact on global economy because of what it was going to do to the global population and the future of young people. And by and large, even though it was not completely eradicated, it was checked. So that is the same approach which needs to happen along this conversation. How can we tell the story in the language of the people with the biggest numbers, which are the youth, people who have the most impact as far as some decisions are concerned, which are the women? How do we tell this story, and disseminate it through platforms that they engage with on a daily basis? Without that, the story will die. When a story dies, a relationship dies.
Exactly.
Even a personal one. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And those are very powerful words, which just keep. I think there's if you're listening and you've heard what the panelists are saying, I think you definitely have questions and you definitely have something to say. And I would love to share and speak, to bring Wanja, who is kind of handling the communication as well on the platforms that we have. Wanja, what do we have out there?
We have a lot of comments coming through. We have Game, who is saying that as we talk about terminology, we have found the lack of climate change vocabulary in our local languages is a huge problem for audiences to contextualize these very Western references. So does anyone know how the rest of the continent is doing in this regard? How do the filmmakers on the panel approach this challenge? We have Miriam who is saying, thanks to the panel, what are some of the strategies to ensure that communities can follow up on their stories or issues for sustainability and continued action from resource and duty bearers? We also have Jacqueline, who is saying that as storytellers, there is a fine line between sharing scientific information, bringing compassion and empathy, and telling the stories that audiences will identify with. Then we have Diplex, who says that he's agreeing with some of the suggestions that have come forth, and says that local financing is lacking, and creatives in the storytelling space have to look for outside grants and donor support. And we have Ted, who agrees by saying that we need to meet the audiences where they are. If they can be found on TikTok, then we go there and comply with the format. So that's some of what we are getting from Zoom and what we've managed to filter out so far.
I think that you guys, there's a couple of questions that I think that are really good fodder for conversation. The first one was conversation of language. How have storytellers, particularly with the changing dynamics of climate change and the different, very difficult words that you were mentioning earlier, Sam, that people are talking about, how have communities adapted to that, and how are communities trying to communicate that?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of research on communication, language, and how to pass on the message on climate change. Now, climate change will remain a complex scientific concept, but there are ways in which it can be communicated in a way that is easily understood, not just to the rural communities or to upcountry communities, but even to people who are storytellers. An increase in temperature across the world could be distilled and simplified as rising temperatures, not global warming. Okay, so there are ways in which storytellers coming from different communities can be able to reword the communication to make it sensible, understandable, palatable to the local communities. But I think that's a challenge which the likes of Pete should take up. Because in this ecosystem, I am more of a disseminator than a creator.
What do you think?
Okay, for me, I think you should use the simple things that the communities have been having, like the resources they have been having, the natural resources they have. For example, if they used to live in an area with a river flowing, and now this river is completely drying. Like, for example, El Sonero, the way I approached it is I started asking the history. So they started telling me this river was always full. There's no time it will dry. But currently, it can run for 3 months, then it dries up if there are no rains. So now that's where now we started like talking. Now that's what is called climate change. Now, of course, I can't say climate change, but in our local language, we try to come up with words to explain what is really happening. So from that perspective, they start now understanding there's something going on. And it's because of different factors. And even those factors, let's say if it's man-made or it's just natural, you start explaining. Like, for example, you'll tell them, like, if you continue cutting down trees, then you'll end up with no trees, the river will die, the livestock you have will also die because the trees, you start explaining slowly by slowly, but not coming with these big terms, global warming, as you said, or I don't know, emissions of carbon dioxide. Even me, I'm struggling with it. So that's how you approach it. And you let them tell you. For example, even me, I didn't know, I'm a Maasai, but I didn't know there's a way they would read what is happening with this goat skin. This is how they'll tell you, okay, this and this place will be dry, this and this place. So you before you come to them with your language, can you try understand their language first, where they're coming from? Then when you understand where they're coming from, then you guys can work together. Then the other issue, how we can make it more creative. For me, I felt like as a creative, there are people who are doing arts, as us as storytellers, we are shooting. There are different of people who are creative. So how about us as creatives, we try make it lively, not always sad. But of course, some stories are sad, but can we try come up with a way we can tell them in such a way that us youths or the younger generation can appreciate it? Or maybe for a filmmaker, instead of always shooting very serious stuff, can we make very simple creative shots and maybe throw it in Instagram, throw it in TikTok? Yeah, with that slowly people will start, where the youth ourselves will start reacting to what we see. If it's something to do maybe with a certain village, can we make it relatable? For example, for me, I love traveling and I love photography just for fun. So I'm trying also as I work. Sometimes, yes, let's just be true to ourselves. Sometimes it's exhausting, but I try to indulge myself. Okay, I'm traveling. This is what. So I'm trying to learn as an adventurous person. But in the process, I'm also creating a story. So that's how even me myself, at times I get motivated to go out there because I'm going to a new place. I want to adventure. I want to meet new people, and I want to know more about them. So from there, now you start telling stories easily. Not always it's work, I'm going to shoot. It gets tiresome at times.
And I think something you've mentioned, which kind of ties with one of the questions we had or comments, was a lot of our work is tied to an agenda.
Yeah.
Someone where the money is coming from, and you feel where the money is coming from dictates you have to do this serious story. So when you're should I indulge in this thing that makes me happy? It becomes problematic to be I can't, that kind of thing. And I think Zeynab, you've actually engaged with a lot of these communities, and they have different ways in which they understand and explain what's going on and what's taking place. How are you handling it, and where do you feel is kind of the way forward in that engagement?
Remember, I started by saying communities actually know that climate is changing. They just know it in a different language. So usually I start by asking them leading questions. For example, the easiest story actually to tell right now is the malaria story in Baringo County. Baringo is an area that shouldn't have mosquitoes. Yet now we have so many cases of malaria in Baringo. Remember last year, the year before, when stories of deaths, malaria deaths were making headlines in the media. Because that's something strange to report on malaria in Baringo. Usually malaria will tell about malaria in Western Kenya or parts of the coast. Rarely will you hear about it in Baringo. Now, for this, the scientists will tell you the reason the mosquitoes are there is because of climate change, because it's changing the behavior of insects and pests, and that also includes mosquitoes, such that you'll find mosquitoes now ending up in places like Baringo where they shouldn't be in the first place. So to ask this community about climate change, of course, you can't just ask them climate change. They may not know what that word is, but they will tell you they have noticed their mosquitoes at night. They will tell you they are now suffering more of malaria. They will tell you their nights are now warmer or the days are warmer. And so you have to learn how to piece all this information together to reach the goal you're trying to reach. They will give you bits and pieces, that when you put them all together, now it creates that climate change picture that you're looking for.
I started laughing when I was thinking that I need to ask Pete whether he's ready to tell this happy story about the happy climate change stories. Is that something you're up to? How, the balance that Laissa was talking about and simplicity that Zeynab is also talking to? What do you think?
No, I think yes. It's a yes and a no, because as people were talking the last time, I was really thinking, and I think the mistake as a story makers have made with climate change is basically, I think we've tried to become scientists in a sense, because a scientist has done this research over so many years, and then very detailed about how the temperature is rising, how this is affecting, and then we as storytellers just try to regurgitate that research rather than us being storytellers, and then find, yes, this is what they found out, but what is the impact? What does this mean to the person, to the family, to the village, to the country? And I guess I don't know whether I feel like a happy story, but the point is we should, as filmmakers, try to find that human connection. And I think I was growing up, but I remember with the HIV problem, like film played such a crucial role in informing, engaging, and also just connection. I remember, I forgot, there's this very famous musician, there's a film about his life story and how HIV and AIDS affected him. And we could all connect to that. But somehow with climate change, as storytellers, there's been few, but we're a bit behind in bringing the humanity to the issue. As what happened with, I was still a young person, but I remember films that I really connected with and empathized with. And I think that is the future, and maybe that's what needs to happen. We let the scientists be scientists, and we as filmmakers bring that empathy, bring that connection and relatability to the issue of climate change.
I'd like to take it back to Wanja. Do we have any more comments, questions in the conversation?
Sam, I think I'm going to read you one interesting comment over here from Diblex, who says, it looks like this conversation is bigger than climate change. Scope and power of storytelling can be tapped to address most societal ills and issues affecting our daily livelihoods, and to redefine the Africa and the world we want going forward, and this will require all hands on deck. So that's pretty much what we have, and that pretty much sums up everything that we're getting.
Yeah. No, that's true. Storytelling can change so much and in so many spaces, because Sammy was talking about HIV and AIDS, Pete said the same thing. We're now trying to talk about climate change, and we're like, as storytellers, do we really want to engage in conversations of climate change? Or why are we not engaging in conversations of climate change? What do you think?
Yeah, we need to constantly engage in this story, but we also need to note that a lot has changed in the past 10 years. So even how we approach, how we are telling these stories is very different from how we told stories 10 years ago. We need to consider that we are going through a lot of disruption, digital transformation. So the challenge to storytellers would be to look at what is first in terms of consumption. We are living in a mobile-first world whereby your mobile phone is your first screen, your tablet could be a secondary screen, your laptop could be a third screen, and your television set could be your fourth screen. So could storytellers challenge themselves to have a mobile-first approach? Because that will be the fastest way to disseminate this story. It could be in the form of text for the bigger population which does not have smartphones, and for the population which has smartphones, could you create based on available platforms which make these stories better consumable, shareable, relatable? So that is the challenge to storytellers. You need to progress based on the disruption which we are seeing in the world. Thank you.
No, very true, very true. So as we wind up, I want to give like a minute to everyone to kind of, share your thoughts about this conversation, and what words would you like to leave the people who are watching or who would watch or listen? We'll start with Laissa.
Okay, for me, what I think for the creative space majorly, I think all stakeholders, we should have a platform that it allows all of us to come together and agree on what is to be told and how to tell it. For example, like for me, like majorly, if I try to look for funds, I always try to apply outside from other foreign countries. But in Kenya, when I'm trying to apply for funds, it's either I'm not getting the right channels or something like that. But it's easy for me to apply funds from outside, but it's very hard for me to apply funds from Kenya. So maybe we simplify the processes for our creatives in our countries so that it's easier to go out and shoot these stories and tell these stories. Yeah.
What are your final words?
Organizations, individuals, NGOs need to be incentivized in one way or the other to be able to have an agenda, because the issue of climate change is not going to be addressed and won if we leave it as a government problem, a problem of the UN or a foreign government. This story needs to continue to be told, and organizations need special incentives. It should be like one of the goals for every organization which is in operation, because one way or the other, each of us contributes towards the degradation of climate. We use cell phones. We have servers. We are on email. The servers have a lot of emissions which contribute to climate change. There's a lot of e-waste which is necessary because of the tools of trade that we use. So each of us needs to be incentivized to be part of this climate change story. Without that, we will not be able to scale it, and we will not have as much impact as we would want to have to save our planet.
No, it's very true. Filmmakers especially are guilty of all our tools of our trade, from the hard disks to the tapes to where do all these things go? Zeynab, what's your parting shot?
For me, two things. One, it's important to know that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's important to know that climate change affects different communities differently, even within Kenya. The needs for a community in one part of the country are not the same as the needs for a community in another part of the country. This therefore means you can't copy and paste solutions. The solutions have to be tailored, community tailored, specific to a certain community to address their specific needs, because the needs will vary from group to group. And secondly, I feel that we can meet and talk about all these fancy things and come up with all kinds of fancy solutions. But if government is not supporting, then we might as well be doing nothing. Because if government does not provide the all these solutions, all these things, we were saying the documents you come up with, will just sit in a shelf and rot. Why government needs to provide the environment is there's a feeling also that government could also be the weak link in the climate conversation, because on one end, government will talk about, oh, we need to plant trees, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. But on the other end, government is not funding the research required to actually come up with those solutions. Government is not funding this tree planting initiatives. The Ministry of Environment has a plan to plant, I think, 50 million trees over the next 2 years. They don't have the money to do that. They will submit a budget and Treasury will slash that budget. You see, so on one end, the government talks about all these fancy things, but on the other, stifling those same solutions by failing to give the money to actually do what they need, and continues to approve. Nairobi right now, the temperatures in Nairobi right now have risen from about 18.8 degrees in the 50s to now 19.5 degrees. You can see that difference in 50 years. And that's because our capital city is now a concrete jungle. We are approving all these concrete constructions without a plan for how we will contain all this heat that this concrete jungle is going to be generating. Why are we not telling every contractor you must submit a plan of how you incorporate trees into your construction, how you will harness green energy so that you can maintain the city to be cool? So I feel government will talk big, or we can also sit and talk big, but if government is not supporting the talk and not supporting the actions, then we'll just keep having this conversation every day.
Very, very true. Pete?
As it's unfortunate that we're dealing with climate change and its repercussions, and it's affecting a lot of people individually, collectively, but I'm optimistic in a sense because I think especially the younger generation, people are getting more aware, but what's making me more optimistic is I'm sure there are storytellers out there who are documenting, telling stories about climate change. And it's coming up. Like we started from a very low base, but right now the young, energized, and they want to tell the world, we want to tell the villages what's happening. And what we need to be talking about is maximizing on the impact of these films, but also maximizing on spreading the knowledge as much as possible. And then hopefully, because sometimes change comes from the ground, and when there's more people who know what needs to be done, it will trickle up, and maybe our governments will take it seriously, and many other governments will take the issue seriously. So it's unfortunate we're here, but I'm optimistic that change will come.
Wow, thank you so much to Pete, Zeynab, Sammy, and Laissa for being here and having this conversation. I feel like there has to be a lot of listening and adaptation that needs to happen in the next, just from today, from now, for us to move forward. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation, and I would love to hand over to Wanja to take us to the next segment.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate the conversations and you bringing us to this point and navigating through the different perspectives from the jargon of climate to translating that creatively and to finally getting it to the audience and also just identifying the gaps that exist between and within the different stakeholders. Thank you. So now we are going to do this poll. It's very simple and it's going to take about a minute of your time. So it's 2 questions. Just go on. The first one is, can storytelling help demystify climate issues to the public? And the second question is, do you think information on climate finance should be made more available to the public? We'd love to hear what you think on these 2 questions. So go on and give us a quick vote. Just click on your screen. And here we are. We have the quick result out. On question 1, we have a resounding yes. Yes, storytelling can help demystify climate issues to the public. Second question is also a resounding yes. We are in agreement. Do you think information on climate finance should be made possible and available to the public? Yes, it's a yes, yes, yes. Thank you for your participation. We're going to be making all this available later on the website and on all our platforms. And now, just join us. We're about to get into some quick vox pops. These are just opinions that we collected of people in different areas in the city on what they think about different topics on climate, from renewable energy to climate finance, just trying to gauge where we are at on the discourse of climate. So that's coming up right next. And then after that, we're going to get into putting money into perspective, where we are saying that there's a reason why certain narratives spread and stick, and one of them is because they're paid for. So how can we then start normalizing to pay for this work? So that's how our afternoon agenda is going to look. And so going now into the vox pops. Thank you so much.
Whenever I hear the word climate change, whatever comes into my mind is about nature. the way we have interfered with the environment that has caused the environment to change.
What I can describe climate change generally is changes in the environmental changes. That is when maybe people are expecting rain, it doesn't rain. When people are expecting sunshine, then it starts raining. That kind of diversity in the climate.
Venye naelewa ni weather na make climate, so venye tunabadilisha weather for a long time, climate inabadilika. Na zile vitu tunakaa tuseme hizo kukata miti, tunabadilisha climate.
Ni weather kubadilika, kunakuwa cold, kunakuwa mara jua, haina ile msimamo.
Tulikuwa tunazoea mvua mwezi wa 4. Alafu sasa tunaona sasa kama hii wakati ilinyesha mwezi wa 2 mpaka mwezi wa 4 hatujakuwa na mvua vile. Sasa hivyo kulingana na hiyo climate change ina affect kama vyakula kwa shamba. Kama mlikuwa mnatarajia hiyo mvua ikuje kuze hiyo mimea kwa shamba, au unaona mvua ikichelewa inakuwa affected.
For me, basically, I'll just put climate change as rain, sunshine. That is what I know. Change of environment and maybe change of climate pattern, raining, sunny, drought. Yeah.
When I hear the word climate change, what crosses my mind is that the change in weather and climate. It can be either sunshine or rain.